Welcome to my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the link in the lower right hand corner to subscribe to my channel. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting apple tree. The photograph on the right was the reference for my painting, and the photo on the left is my interpretation of the scene. It wasn't an attempt to make a photographic copy of it. It was to capture the essence of the photograph and the subject and play up a lot of the shapes, positive and negative, that are created by the activity in the photograph with the apple and all the overlapping leaves and shapes. I've drawn a light pencil sketch of the major shapes on my paper, which is a quarter sheet, 11 inches by 15 inches of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I'll be working at about a 20-degree angle. As with many fruit, apples have little speckles called lenticels. They create a pattern of little white spots, and I wanted to pick up that pattern in the apple. So to do that, I'm going to take a fine line masking fluid bottle, and I'm going to just put some dots around the shape of the apple. I'm not trying to copy the exact count of spots on the apple in my picture. I'm just randomly putting them around in some areas here. In certain areas I'm concentrations a little greater than others. I'm not going to cover the entire shape with these. And to the left here, as I'm placing these are closer together because of perspective. They would be closer together, and the ones that are coming around towards the front are going to be farther apart because you're looking directly at those, and it's not a foreshortened view. I'll let the masking fluid completely air dry, and then I'll begin painting. Before I begin, I'll do a quick review of the colors used in my painting. Rose madder quinacridone, quinacridone coral, alizarin crimson quinacridone, quinacridone violet, sap green, quinacridone burnt orange, and royal blue. I'm going to begin working wet on dry, and I'll quickly move into wet in wet application. So I'm putting down a wash, a light valued wash of sap green that has been toned down a little bit with some rose madder quinacridone. And I'm cutting this wash around some of the shapes here, in particular the shape of the apple. I don't want to put that green really on the apple, because when I come back in with the reds, it's going to lose some of the intensity. Sometimes I cut around shapes because I'm trying to preserve the white. In this case, I'm preserving the white so that I can keep the intensity in the reds that I'm going to apply there. Your colors are going to be the brightest, most intense when they're applied over the pure white paper. If I were to take my red tones and apply them over this light green wash, it's really going to tone down the intensity of the chroma of that application. I'm going to add a little bit of a darker mixture to this wash that I'm putting down. And putting this underpainting on here, this initial kind of a foundation wash, is going to help bring some unity to the overall composition. And some of these areas where I'm applying this wash, this is what you're going to see when the finished painting is complete, because I'll start to build layers on top of this. In some of these areas I'll never touch again with my brush, but I'll be working around building shapes and bringing out areas, sending other areas back. And this is where I like to say that your watercolor takes on the personality of watercolor, with some of these free-flowing soft edges and subtle blending of color, some of the nice gradations of value and color. But it does this, by putting down an overall wash, help bring some unity to the overall composition. And as I paint this at this stage, I'm not seeing individual leaves so much or branches or any level of detail. I'm seeing larger shapes, larger areas of value. The apples are large shapes. Some of these leaves are large shapes. The branches can be large shapes, a couple of the big branches. But there's this area that I've put down this wash in is a large area of a light middle value, pretty much leaning towards a light value. And it's a larger shape. Well, I started working wet on dry. As I've been working with this, I've been adding moisture to the paper. My paper is saturated, and I've begun to work wet and wet in these areas. And when I use this spray bottle, I saturate the paper even more. So I started wet on dry, now I'm working wet on wet. And I'm going to introduce some more of a middle value in here. And you'll see touches of red in here. So while I tone down my sat green that I first applied with just a touch of a red tone, the mixture I'm applying now has a greater ratio of red in the mixture, and you can see that coming through, and it starts to mingle and merge with some of the paint on the paper, and it gives me a little bit of a warm and cool tone that I'm putting down. I've started to get darker with my value, but because my paper is saturated, this application is going to get diluted some, and it's going to be lighter when it dries. And that red I'm using is the rose madder quinacridone. My paper is thoroughly dry, and now I'm going to begin to work on these shapes that represent the apples. So I'm working wet on dry to start, and I'm using a light wash, but I'm going to quickly move into more intense and darker valued colors. As I paint these red apple shapes, I'll be working with combinations of rose madder quinacridone, quinacridone coral, alizarin crimson quinacridone, and quinacridone violet. The quinacridone coral will be the brightest red tone, and the quinacridone violet will be more of a red-violet tone. But as I paint this, I'll be taking paint from my palette in various combinations of these four main colors. You can see how rich that color is working on the white paper. If I had let that green wash go over top of this area, it wouldn't be near as vibrant. And I've intentionally left that area in the top kind of left of that apple light to represent kind of the shine and the reflection in that. And I'm painting this as a big shape with gradation going on within it. And another approach to this type of a subject is to take more of a botanical approach, where you take small brushes and you very methodically render and try and recreate the image. But that's not the approach that I'm taking, and it's not my interpretation of my subject. Here you can see I'm working wet and wet, and I've come back with some deeper red-violet tones with the quinacridone violet. And just a little splatter just to give some texture. And there's some other apples that are peeking through, so I'm going to paint some shapes of red there to represent them. You can see I like to blot a lot with a tissue. Helps soften edges, helps create texture. As long as my paper is saturated, I can come in here with a fully loaded brush with a lot of moisture and bring richer tones into what I've already laid down. But the minute that paper starts to move from saturated towards a dampness, instead of having a gloss, it starts to get more of a satin sheen. I start to risk getting backwash, areas of backwash. There's some kind of striations that occur in the apple going from the top to the bottom. So I'm trying to use some direction with my brush strokes to suggest that pattern that develops in the apple. I want to get even a deeper tone into this red, so I'm going to take some of that quinacridone violet with just a touch of royal blue and go deeper with this mixture. So it's a darker value, still a red violet, and this paper still remains saturated because I've put a lot of moisture into it. So as I put these brush strokes down, I'm going to get soft edges. And I want a bit more of this dark tone on this area on the right side. I want to bring that around a little bit more on the apple. So also some of these brush strokes, I'm trying to contour the shape of the apple as I make these brush strokes. You can see that the color diffuses some just because that paper is so wet. One of the things I'll need to be careful on as I develop my painting is I don't want this apple to feel like it was peeled out off a piece of paper and stuck on this. I need to create some overlap or some of the lost edges on this apple as the painting develops, even though that apple is on top of everything. I'm going to break some of those edges down a little bit so that it doesn't feel like it's just stuck on there. And here I've started to paint another red shape here. I'm just making a record of where some of these shapes are. I'm not really fully developing that area yet. I'll go a little darker there. And I'm going to put some touches of this red in a few places, not because I see them in my picture, a few of these I do, but because it will help bring some balance to my composition, so everything isn't just feel so stuck on in a few spots. So I'm just going to make a few marks of this red just to show where there's some apples could be peeking through the leaves, but it helps bring this red around throughout my composition rather than just feeling isolated in a few big apple shapes. Now I'm going to start to work in some of the areas where all the leaves and the branches are, and I'm going to be doing quite a bit of negative painting, working off the exterior edges of other shapes. And I've lightly drawn some leaf and branch shapes in my initial sketch, but a lot of this I'll develop as I go through the painting. I'm looking at the shapes, large, medium, small, that are created by the positioning of some of these shapes near one another or overlapping, and I start to play those shapes up. So here I started to take a darker green value and push some of those areas back in space with a darker value. So I want them to feel like you're looking past that apple, going deeper into the composition. And I'm using sap green with a little bit of rose madder quinacridone. And some of these will also have a little bit of royal blue in it to give me a darker value. And this process takes a while because you're pulling out little shapes. You're painting off of the edge of other objects and defining other shapes by creating smaller shapes of value along some of their edges. Some case larger shapes. You can see I'm starting to spread that shape making activity and spread that value. And as I do this, you start to create overlap, you start to have interlocking shapes. And as I said, as this paint develops, I want to break into some of the edge on the apple there so it doesn't feel as stuck on, but just positioning some of the darker values that are similar to what's on the apple beside it, that you start to lose some of those edges and it starts to feel like it's less of a cutout that's pasted on. And when we're working like this, if you have your photo, you can look for little areas that are interesting that you can incorporate into your shape making. But a lot of it too is just making up shapes that you see within your drawing, within your painting as it develops. You have to reach a point where you go beyond just trying to copy everything in a photograph. I have this branch shape drawn just to the right of the apple, a kind of a thick branch. And I'm going to start working to define that branch, and I'm going to do it by painting around it. I'm not going to paint the branch, I'm going to paint some of the shapes around it. So I'm working off the exterior edge of that branch, and I call that the negative edge. And now I'm going to work on the other side. And by doing so, you can start to see that branch take shape, and it continues on up as it goes around the apple. Now I'm going to glaze over this branch shape that I've left the pure white of the paper, and because it's the white of the paper, I'm going to get a nice intense color. If I had glazed over that with the green, that wouldn't be the case, just as was the case with the apples. So I've got my burnt orange I'm putting down, and as I'm doing this, I'm saturating the paper so I can do some more brush work in this, working wet on wet. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to charge that wash a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit more pigment in there and make it pick up the intensity. And I'm going to come also with a mixture of the quinacridone burnt orange with some royal blue in it, and I'm going to charge that with a cooler tone, with a darker value tone to suggest the shadowed side of this branch. If I were doing this when the paper was damp, I'd risk getting backwash, but my paper is still very saturated, so this paint that I'm applying and the moisture just diffuses into that saturated paper. Now I'm going to take a mixture of quinacridone burnt orange with royal blue, but it's leaning more towards the royal blue side, and kind of meeting in the middle at a gray. So as I paint this, I'm going to have some cooler tone, and I'll also work in some warmer tone, and I'll use a little bit of rose madder quinacridone also. Right there you can see it's leaning more towards the red, and that helps pick up some of those red tones in the apple and helps balance some of that color throughout my composition. I'm going to continue to work in negative space with some of these green mixtures of sap green with some rose madder in it, and I want to try and pull some larger shapes out of this. So there's a lot of activity here with overlapping and interlocking shapes. I want to start to push some areas back. I'll start to build darker values and make some of it. You can get too busy in some of this brush work. At some places you have to tie some larger shapes together, and I'll do that by matching values on adjoining shapes and also by glazing over. So I'm going to take a bit of a darker glaze right here and glaze over what I've done there. Now that paper underneath is dry as I apply this glaze, and even though I'm glazing over it, you can still see the brushwork lightly from underneath from that was put on there prior, but it holds together now more as one shape. Now I'm going to take a glaze and put over some larger areas, and this will help tie some of these things together. It'll push some areas back and bring other areas forward. And when you're putting a glaze like this over some of the washes you've already laid down, you don't want to overwork it with your brush because you're going to agitate what's underneath, and you could get some undesirable results. I'm using a very soft brush as I apply this, and you can see I'm painting around some of these branches here, and that helps push that green tone back a little bit, and the branches come forward. And you don't want the same level of detail and contrast all over the whole composition. It gets very flat, and it's hard to establish depth. And when you look in the top left corner, I've put that glaze over, and now I've toned down the contrast in that part of the painting. When you juxtaposition areas of lesser contrast against areas of greater contrast, then you start to help lead the viewer into the areas that you really want their attention to be, into the focal point. Often your strongest areas of contrast are going to be in and around your focal point. So I'm taking a pickup eraser, I'm lifting up the masking fluid that I put on before I started to paint, so you can start to see those white spots, but I don't want them to be that strong. Right now they're very strong white spots against that dark red. So I'm going to take a damp, stiff brush, and I'm going to scrub around those spots. So it's going to drag some of that red paint that I've already put down, and it's going to tone down those white spots. And at the same time, I'm creating a pattern, starting to contour some of those that apple shape with the brush strokes that I'm taking with this, creating a highlight on the bottom of the apple. But now I'm going to take this, I want to soften these white spots. But I want to do it with regards to the contour of that apple, the shape, because as I do this, it's going to leave a mark, and this will do two things. It'll tone down those little white speckles that I have, and it'll also create this pattern of striations in this apple. Some would think that I've got some of my strongest values down, but I really don't. I'm going to come in now with some much darker valued mixtures. Here, this is a mixture that I have with sap green and some quinacridone rose madder, but I've also added royal blue into my mixture, so it's much darker value. You can see some of those areas that seem to be a dark value before I put this down are actually, they're just a middle value. And this is, to me, this is shape making. This is something I like to do. I like to play around some of the edges and look for shapes that I can pull out. And you know, most often you're creating shapes and you're leaving things out. It's takes a little bit of patience and a little bit of imagination, but I enjoy doing this type of painting. Now I'm going to carry some of those darker values over towards the other side of my composition. You don't want the values to be isolated. You want to have some of that carried throughout the composition, but you do need to have certain areas where it's more dominant. One of the things that happens when you start to build up this range of values, you can start to get a feeling of overlap and depth in your composition. And don't forget to take these shapes all the way to the edge. You don't want to have a painting that just has a subject floating in the middle of it, unattached to anything. The edges of your painting are part of your composition too, so you need to be aware of the shapes that you have and how they interact with the edges of your painting. Now I'm just going to take some deeper red tones and bring out some of these other apple shapes that are scattered about the page. And I'm going to paint this whole shape, and then I'm going to take a tissue and soften an area here with some gentle blotting to lift up some of the paint to create just a bit of a glow. So this again is the mixtures of alizarin crimson, quinacridone coral, rose madder, quinacridone, and some quinacridone violet. So right now that area I just painted is very wet, the paper is saturated, and if I take a tissue and gently blot that area, I can get a highlight. I want to deepen the value on this a little bit, so I'm going to take some quinacridone violet with a little bit of royal blue in it, and I'll drop some of that into this wash that I just put down. I want some of that intense red in a few of these other areas, so I'm going to just put just a touch of that. And then I'm going to take some of that up to a few other areas here. In the bottom of the apple is part of the coming out of the core there is an area that's a little leafy, and it has some dark tones, but it also has some light highlights, and I really didn't save any of that, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to lift out a small area of paint to clear some of the paint out and leave some white paper here. It won't get back to pure white, but it'll be pretty close. And I've put some rice tape around it. Now I'm going to scrub it out with a magic eraser, one of the Mr. Clean type magic erasers. Now lift up this rice tape, and you can see that I have a light square there. So now I can go in and do some painting around this, but leave a little bit of the pure whites to use as lights. But first I'm going to dry this with a hairdryer. So I'm going to take my rigger brush here and just detail a little bit of the bottom of the apple there. So I've painted in some of the red tone, and then I'm going to come in with a little bit of a darker value there that's going to have some royal blue in it, and I just hit it briefly with a hairdryer here. It doesn't take much, but I want that to be dry when I come back in with a darker tone because I'm maintaining some harder edges in that small shape. So I'm taking a darker value here. It's pretty much a royal blue, a little alizarin crimson, and just put a few brush marks here. And now I have my bottom of the apple. I want to create a little texture on these branches, so I'm just dragging the side of my rigger brush with a mixture here that's got some quinacridone and burnt orange and a little bit of royal blue, just giving some texture. Early in the painting, I had talked about breaking some of the edges of the apple shape there so it didn't look like it was stuck on, and I've softened some of the edges and matched some values along it so it doesn't look quite as stuck on, but I'd like to have a little bit more overlap. And one of the things I like to do when I'm working with florals or subjects like this, I like to have some linear marks, kind of grassy looking shapes that I lift off. So here I have an angled nylon brush and it's damp, and I'm doing some lifting because my paper's dry, and it works very well when the paper's thoroughly dry to take a damp brush like this, and especially when there's some dark tones, and lift off some of the pigment. And I also like to drag some of that pigment, but I'm creating some linear marks that are breaking the edges on this apple. In doing so, I'm creating just some subtle overlap. And here again, I just going off over some of the green areas and over some of the other apples there, just to create overlap, which helps build depth and just ties everything together a little bit more. Now, to complement the lifting, I like to come back in with something like my rigger brush, and here I have a dark green, and I make some linear marks that are similar to the marks that I got when I lifted the paint. So here again, you can see I went over the apple, create a little overlap over the branch, and I lift my brush periodically when I want to make it look like it's stopping on the edge of something, perhaps going underneath and coming out on the other side. But by using some of these linear marks, I can help reinforce edges, and I can create overlap, which helps create the feeling of depth. I'm going to do some more brush work with some darker values here. And so I'm putting this dark value on this leaf shape. So now I've been doing a lot of negative brush work, and I'm still doing some negative brush work, but by creating actually painting a positive shape there. So on the one end, on the left side, it's coming down over a lighter area. That's more of a positive edge. But as it comes back up to the other leaf, it's acting as a negative edge, and it's helping to find that leaf. So here's some more darker values and just some shapes. And when I put marks like this down, I'm normally trying to strengthen an edge or help distribute a value or a color, and helps balance my composition, or just making some interesting shapes that are designed to try and help draw a viewer into an area. It helps create contrast and establish contrast in an area. Here again, you need to treat the edge as part of your composition. Here I continue to do some of my brush work, and as I said, this is a thing that I enjoy doing. I like as I wind down my painting, and I look for areas that I want to bring out a little bit more, add just another touch to. And these little shapes, little marks, little lines, dots, dashes, small shapes, really, I think, add some dimension to the painting. And it's often in the later stages where I do this and I go through this process. And this is not copying photographs. So this is my interpretation of my subject, but I'm doing it with regards to composition and design, and just having a little bit of fun with it. And again, you want to have a balance, and if you look, I really don't have much of that value on this side of the paper, so I'm going to take some of that, bring it off. We're going to soften that edge a little bit. I'm going to put a few touches of the value up in this right corner, but not a lot, but just enough to tie it into the rest of the composition. And I like to try and create some movement and a feeling of motion with some of these linear marks that I make, and some of these arcing grassy shapes as they move across the composition and off the page. Give an indication of that branch carrying on. Just a few brush marks is all I need. And I'm going to carry a leafy shape, just a light kind of a transparent glaze almost over the top of this apple. Just create a little more overlap. And even though you can see through it, and you know you can't see through a leaf, I like the shape. I like how it just overlaps and breaks the edge of the apple and the branch. Just try and tie it in with that value. I'm going to repeat those shapes a little higher here on the page, and take that another leaf shape off the edge. I'm going to put one more up here, and I'm not putting these here because I looked at the photo and saw them. I'm putting here because I want to create this repetition with this little grouping of leaves, and give the feeling that they're coming closer to you in the foreground, and that they're overlapping the apple and the branches that are underneath it. I'm going to repeat that darker toned leaf shape one more time here beside this other apple shape, and it's still going to leave some transparency in it. Now I'm going to put a white mat on this to get rid of the tape and the board, and there you have my painting apple tree. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you want to subscribe to my channel or see more videos, you can click on one of the boxes on the screen.